So my name is Yasemin Lamy. I'm with Omidyar Network. We're a funder who's joined the digital identity world in the last year. We basically invest across, we're a philanthropic investment firm that invests for individual empowerment around the world. And we have historically invested in topics such as financial inclusion, education, property rights. We have a governance and citizen engagement portfolio, and we also have an emerging technology portfolio. And we came to the digital identity space after reflecting on how these portfolios together can cohesively build an empowerment story for individuals, and realized actually that we were missing a key enabler to that empowerment, which was the identity piece. And so we're really pleased to be here. We are going to be talking today about the user voice, and I'm really excited about the work that my partners here have been doing in the past year on researching user experiences around identity. So I have Jonathan Donner here to my left from Caribou Digital, and Kyla Reid from GSMA, who are going to be talking today about the research that they've been conducting in India and in Cote d'Ivoire, Pakistan, and Tanzania. So I thought I would just start by setting the scene that, I think as we at Omidyar Network started to explore the space around digital identity, the first question we always ask is, we don't want to duplicate efforts, so where are there gaps? And it became clear to us that there were gaps in terms of voices from actual people using identities. And so we're really excited to be working with partners in the field who are doing this research. So at this point, I'm going to hand over first to Kyla, who's going to talk through some of the research that she did in those 3 countries. And then we'll hand over after that to Jonathan. Each of them have about 8 to 10 minutes to talk through the research that they've been doing. And then we'll open up for questions. I've got a few to start us off. We'll take some from the audience as well. Over to you, Kyla.
Great. Thanks, Yasemin. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kyla Reid, and I run our digital identity work and our humanitarian work at the GSMA. How many of you have heard of the GSMA? Okay, that's more than I thought. And how many of you have cell phones in your pockets, handbags? Everyone? Okay. So the GSMA is the trade association for the mobile phone industry globally, and the group that I work in is called Mobile for Development, and that's really a part of the organization where we believe that the potential reach and scale of mobile technology in the developing world offers a transformative opportunity to provide life-enhancing services to people who otherwise may not have access to those services. So to the topic at hand, end-user perspectives for digital identity. The digital identity program is quite new in our Mobile for Development portfolio, and it kind of occurred to us really early on as we were doing this research to understand what the kind of implications of this ID gap are, the 1.2 billion people who don't have access to official ID would mean in terms of service delivery and technology, that we didn't know enough about what the user journey looked like and what the challenges that people faced by not having ID actually were in some of the markets that we were targeting. And without having a sense of what the user experience and user perspective and attitudes and preferences are, it's very difficult for us to advise our private sector partners like mobile operators around the types of solutions and services that they can design. We end up with this delta where somebody from a tech team in an office is coming up with a really cool app or platform, but it doesn't really reflect the attitudes, behaviors, and preferences of the people it's trying to serve. So rather than create more solutions, we thought a good starting point would be to go straight to the field and understand from this demographic of what we're calling sort of low-income users in both rural and urban scenarios, and ask them, what ID challenges do they face? What incentives would prevent or encourage them to use ID services? And then thirdly, how does technology come into the picture, and what might they hope to see from a digital identity type of solution? So the slide in front of you sort of provides a high-level picture of some of the profiles of the different people that we spoke to. We did research, as Yasemin mentioned, in 3 different countries, Cote d'Ivoire, Tanzania, and Pakistan. And the selection of those was quite intentional in that in Cote d'Ivoire, you have an ID environment which is very relatively immature. You have very low birth and civil registration, very low access to official ID, and some suspicion around governments providing services because of the legacy of conflict in the country. Then you move to Tanzania, which has about 24% coverage of its national ID, is a very mature mobile money market, so there is high levels of engagement with technology across the income segments. And they're currently investing in building and rolling out their national ID infrastructure, so it's sort of at this inflection point. And then you have a country like Pakistan, which has very intentionally developed a comprehensive national identity program through NADRA, which has about 98% coverage. So we thought it would be interesting to explore what the differences in perspectives are in those three environments to see where the difference and similarities kind of arose. And I think, looking at these three distinct identity journeys, it was very clear to us how contextualized the identity question really is, and that there isn't the same kind of answer set that you'll get from a woman versus a man in an urban versus rural, unemployed, semi-employed, informally employed. There is just such a range of experiences and preferences because it is such an intrinsically unique and personal, I think, concept for people. But there were some overarching kind of key findings that arose in a number of markets, and I'll just talk about those very briefly, and then hopefully we can get into them a bit more in the questions and answers. But I think one of the first key takeaways for us was that end users need and want digital identity solutions that optimize service delivery. So what does that mean? Instead of just turning up to enroll and register to get either a card or a smart card or a mobile credential, people are really looking for an ecosystem that provides services around that. So it's not enough to say, please come and register for your national ID. People need to understand what the utility of that ID is and need to understand how it links to accessing services, whether it's social welfare payments or a mobile money account or access to something that they couldn't get before without it. And I think there's a role there for private sector to come into the fold where systems are designed in a way that allows them to plug in to help support the demand side service development to ensure that people do feel like they're getting something based on this credential. The second is that there is an identity gender gap. So it's not only that there are 1.2 billion people that don't have access to proof of identity documentation, but it's also disproportionately affecting women. And we see this a lot in our research at the GSMA already in terms of the digital gender gap. So there are 200 million fewer women than men who have access to mobile phones, predominantly in developing and emerging markets. So if we sort of consider what the future of digital identity solutions look like in these markets, we have to consider both what that access gap means, but also that there are different cultural norms and behavioral patterns that will mean that women may be having a more difficult time getting access to some of these proof of identity credentials or documents, and then using them to access services on the basis of that. So a dependency on relatives, on husbands, and very different experiences across the three countries that we studied in terms of how access to identity might engender confidence and trust and respect in the community, but equally some of the cultural challenges that might prevent that from coming to fruition. So really a central component from a design perspective to keep in mind. Thirdly, one of the things that we found was that mobile technology is increasingly becoming one of the demand drivers for identity documents at large. So in 90 countries in the world now, there is regulation that requires that you provide a proof of identity document in order to access and register a SIM card to make a mobile call, send a text, have a phone. And so increasingly we're seeing that that's required in countries that don't actually have high coverage of identity documents at large. So trying to understand how that's exacerbating exclusion is something that we're really concerned about and see a lot of intentional further research and policy around trying to address that challenge. And I think the last thing maybe that I'll mention now is that particularly in the groups that we had these discussions with, people welcome the idea of a digital future. You know, people in the last mile, people who are at what we've referred to as the base of the pyramid, are not ignorant to the fact that there is this digital revolution happening in the world. Have 500 million people across Africa who do have mobile phones. We know the rate is going to grow exponentially between now and 2020. So people see this kind of move and leapfrog from analog to digital systems as a process that they want to be part of. They may not necessarily have the digital literacy yet to fully optimize those services or to ensure that they do it in a way that protects their data and privacy, which is another really critical consideration. But they want to be part of this transformation. They want to be able to participate in this ecosystem and use the technology to feel like they're part of this world. So I think considering some of those factors has been really illustrative and informative for us in terms of the kinds of solutions and services that we see being developed and offered across some of these markets. So I'll just pause there quickly and maybe just draw your attention to the slide, which highlights some of the different perspectives that we have seen coming from the countries. So I think one of the key findings in our research has also been that there are very well-established systems of getting around not having ID. And so really working through the incentives of how you encourage people to register, to participate is critical. So in countries like Côte d'Ivoire, people have an easier time potentially amending the birth date on their birth certificate in order to stay in school longer. So if you think about transitioning to a system that is more centralized, that is has higher coverage, and that is digitized, that opportunity is going to be closed. So there's a lot of consideration around, as we see this transition, how people are incentivized or disincentivized to participate, what they might win or lose as part of the process, and making sure that there's strong communication, policy frameworks, and most importantly, the right services to ensure that people are participating and not further left behind. So I'll pause there and hand it over to Jonathan.
Thanks.
Yeah.
That's great. Thanks. I've got a couple slides as well, so maybe we can switch the deck over. Thanks, Kyla, so much, and thanks, Yasemin, for having us. So my name is Jonathan Donner. I'm the Director of Research for a relatively small consultancy called Caribou Digital. We've been working at the intersection of technology and economic development as people and professionals for a long time, but only as a company for about 2 years. We're 2 or 3 years old. We're very lucky to have the support of Omidyar, the Omidyar network, to do this work that we're doing right now in digital identities. We also have partners. I need to acknowledge the partners working with us in India on this study, which is the IIITB Bangalore. So it's IIIT Bangalore. It's the Indian Institute of Information Technology in Bangalore, and a great set of researchers there, kind of merging technical and social science approaches, who've been really instrumental and travelers with us on all of this. Unfortunately, I live in Boston, which is a lot closer than Delhi, or Bangalore, so I'm here talking to you guys today. The work I want to share is very much in progress, which is good and bad. It means the feedback is really important because you guys can fix it if I say something that's not quite right yet. But the work we're doing, with the support of Omidyar is to try to inject a little bit the user voice, as we say, or the person's voice, or the person's experience back into some of these conversations around digital ID and the shift to digital and ID management and ID practice. Humbly, we're not the only ones to do that, and obviously there's been people writing on this for a while and doing studies, but it is our kind of impression that even relative to some other conversations about technology in the developing world or technology in emerging markets, the conversations around digital ID and the shift to digital ID may not have really been able to put the user's experience as central as it should be. So, kind of humbly, we offer this data in the hopes that it's useful not just in India. We happen to be working in India, but for people both in the policy arena and in the technical arena who may be interested in working in this space in other countries as well. So the work we're doing is underway. If you want to follow it, if you want to know what's up, if you want to join us in the conversation, there's a URL which will be on for a few times. It's called the identitiesproject.com. And identities is plural on purpose, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So far, we've talked to about 160 people. With very much unstructured, only semi-structured interviews in a few different regions in India, rural and urban, north and south, and actually east. We're in Assam as well, which has been really interesting for if you know the area, for issues of sort of citizenship and migration. And it's a place where Aadhaar, which is the big national biometric system that's being rolled out in India, is actually not that present yet, which makes it a nice kind of internal counterpoint. And obviously, there's a lot more than I can talk about in a 10-minute session like this. So I'm not even going to try to give you the full sweep of findings. I'm just going to give you a taste, with the hope that maybe you would join the conversation and come look at our stuff and subscribe. And when the report is out, have a look, and if it's useful to you, use it and get in touch with us. So with that kind of preface, I would say that the four things we're trying to do with the study is, I think, similar to some of the stuff that the GSMA has been doing, is by talking to users, talking to people. I like the word people better than user, to be honest with you, but try to uncover some of the pain points and needs around identity management. So this isn't just a moment of enrollment that we're talking about, but this ongoing practice that people have of how they use documents and artifacts. This is the second bullet point. In this kind of presentation of identity, kind of look, and some of us were in a conversation in the session just before this one about the sort of contestation of who owns identity has come up, and I think even in the keynote this morning, some of that came up. And this is not to say that national governments don't have a very central role in issuing credentials and all that, but it is also to say that people have an active role in managing and presenting parts of their identity at certain times to pursue their goals. So our study is really about that second part of the equation. What do identities in practice look like? We hope from those two that we'll be able to kind of offer some further principles to improve user experiences, particularly among marginal and vulnerable populations, and to do all of this from a perspective of what are our recommendations or what are impressions that we would have taken almost as a given, issues of individual privacy, increasing individual agency and capacity and empowerment, choose your word, and dignity as well. So that there are good ways and bad ways to do all this. I know those are all contested terms themselves. We are looking at them as things we want to keep as important. So we're looking at issues of vulnerability and privacy and dignity and agency. So with that, I just have a couple more slides, and then we can chat and see if this works. So like I said, the research is very much kind of qualitative at this stage, semi-structured. Is about as close we get to a systematic interview, and we meet people where they are, and we meet the people. This is where the action is to some extent when we're talking about encoding national ID systems around the world. Is people like the folks we're talking to here. Devi, I believe, is the guy's name up front, and he was a peanut salesperson, and he was one of our first interviews. This is why it's in the materials, even though we haven't finished the work yet. But our researcher, in this case Sarita, just spoke to Devi for about an hour and a half about his experiences using IDs and what ID means to him. So again, big picture as we think about these as practices, we use the word identities as opposed to identity, which I think gets back to some of the conversations that have already come up this morning. And we see this then with this kind of really broad lens. We can then look at maybe the split between IDs that are given to people versus the ones that are constructed by people. We can look at what's material, visible, tangible about an ID versus what is social and belongs to the state or is made by the state or systems. And we can look at both analog IDs and digital IDs, right? So to us, a photograph, if it's meaningful to people, is part of their ID, it's part of their identities, and it's worth having the conversation about. So we've been doing sort of inventories of people's IDs and letting them tell us what's an ID.
I remember there was
yeah.
one story, wasn't there, of someone who had an ID card and an X-ray.
Yeah.
And that was their bundle of identification that they carried around with them. And
Yeah.
so it's trying to uncover, Aadhaar is a big story in India, and this research is tapping into the unintended consequences of that and trying to explore where vulnerabilities have arisen because of that system. But this is also a chance to look more broadly at how do people actually utilize and what defines their identities on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just
no,
had to
it's totally true.
interject
Thank you.
that.
Yeah, so two things off that. I mean, one, I'm not telling you that you need to count a photograph or an X-ray as an identity document, but I am saying that as you think about what your definitions are about what identity documents are and where identity resides and how it is constructed and maintained and contested all the time in real life, if somebody out there views his X-ray as part of his identity, it's worth knowing that and to some extent designing around that if you can. And the other thing is, we chose India. What an easy place to do ID work, right? I mean, in the middle of the Aadhaar rollout is it's an incredibly important place to be looking at this, but not easy. And then we did it right in the middle. Has anybody heard of demonetization? Right. So about 3 weeks before we started the process, the national government took every bill larger than about $20 out of circulation overnight, more or less. And with a desire to push people towards using these digital systems, and there's no better pain point than money to some extent. So there's been spikes in enrollment in mobile money and formal ATMs and getting bank accounts finally up and going. Some people lost their life savings because they'd been stuffed under a mattress and they didn't get things back in time and all that. But what that's done is it's been just a very tense and interesting and evocative time to do this work. And my comments today will barely do justice to the stories we have in the interviews right now, and hopefully by the time I get the reports out, we'll get to talk about that a little bit. Okay, with 2 more slides?
Quickly.
Maybe? One.
Yeah.
Just one. I think it's the last one. 2. Yeah. So, Devi, this is a quote about ID, but it's a quote about life, right? Just one prompt he had back. I don't understand how anyone could misuse it. His lost ID. And that's why I was quiet. But if it's a rich person who's lost his ID, it will matter a lot to him and his money. If it's a poor man's ID, like my ID is lost, it doesn't matter that someone else will know my address and where I live and come find me. I have nothing to lose. I have no money. I don't think he's right. I don't think he's wrong. I don't know. I know that if you're talking about things like identity, you're talking about meaning, and you're talking about the relationship people have with the state and with each other and status and class and all this, and the stuff gets complex quickly, and it's worth, again, moving through that as you're thinking about the systems you're deploying. So that's my only user quote today. So just to summarize, look at it like there's meaning in the mundane. We look at it not that enrollment, the gap you're talking about, isn't necessarily the end of the story, and that some vulnerabilities in society just get shifted in new ways. We need to be sensitive to the harms that come from enrollment and from use. We also maybe need to think about what effective use means as opposed to just having a digital ID. But we think that this broader lens could be really, really helpful for people as we are trying to make these systems work around the world. I don't know. I know the guy who's enrolling this is smiling. That's an Aadhaar enrollment center. I don't know whether the woman is smiling or not. I'd be curious what you guys think she is. Thanks for letting me go a little bit there.
Thank you.
Can I just add something quickly? I think one of the things that struck me in the remarks this morning was this reference back to the web of trust, and I think one of the things that came out really strongly in our research in Tanzania is that this analog web of trust is so strong. Mm-hmm. So there's actually a preference for people to use a letter from their local government official that confers a sense of a greater degree of, what's the word I'm looking for? A greater degree of utility and of importance than the national ID card would. Because the assumption is that my local government official knows me and is therefore personally vouching for me. And so that is more important to me in my identity kind of self-perception and interaction than this card from, the I've picked up at a government office that I don't really understand. But then in a country like Pakistan, where you have a very different kind of security context and a very different relationship between state and citizen, there is this need to have a CNIC card because it's so difficult to move around because of the checkpoints and having to stop and engage with security personnel. So there is this kind of recognition that without that official document, my mobility, my convenience, my own personal safety and security is compromised. So very different perspectives, I think, based on both the driving force for some of these identification systems, but also what the kind of web of trust in an analog environment really looks like.
Yeah, I think that web of trust point and the analog to digital point are really interesting findings. And I remember another story from the identities research, which was basically a woman who went to access her rations and had to shift from her usual method, which was just walking into the ration office, and her face was recognized by somebody she knew, and he would give her her ration, So she shifted from that experience to, now I need to enter my biometric details into the system. The system goes to the central system taps into some database. I have no connection to where my data is or even what happens if it goes wrong. And, she just said, I don't really get it. It was so easy, And there's a lot of, the point you're making about utility, I think, is a really critical one in terms of evidencing why this is beneficial. And this is why we're really hopeful that some of this research will feed into the policymaker decisions and discussions in how they translate what hopefully should be good intentions for their citizens. So I just wanted to ask, so some of what we've talked about have been examples of empowerment. Some of them have been examples of, you use the term, shifting vulnerabilities. Can you each talk about the most poignant story that sticks with you?
Yeah. Do you want to take it away?
Sure. It's funny. I'm gonna take the privilege of saying we have a very broad definition of what identities is, and I ran this by some of the people on the team, and they're like, you got to talk about the guy who had the restaurant. And I'm like, okay, all right, guy with the restaurant. But a Datta who moved from one part of India to Bangalore once his family passed away, just basically started from nothing and has a restaurant. Many people do, but his restaurant relies on Facebook marketing. And it's not the most amazing story because we take it for granted, but this ability to kind of use digital systems to make a livelihood that's sort of associated with ID is a big deal. I'm sure I can go through the data and find other cases where the ration's been done exactly right and all that. And I'm not saying that stuff's not important, but it's just sort of this full jump from kind of a non-digital life to a digital life, where the livelihood requires use of these international platforms is pretty fascinating.
We had a sort of more in-depth interview with a woman in Tanzania. I think her name was Zahara, and she's sort of works selling vegetables in the informal sector. Is I think around a $2 a day person in terms of revenue generation, supporting a very large family, is divorced. And until she got her national ID card, she was unable to register for a mobile money account. So that was her original motivator to go and get enrolled and to get a card. And once she had her mobile money account, she was able to start converting some of her earnings into savings, into her mobile wallet. And she was able to start accumulating, modest amounts of money, but she had a safer place to keep that, and also an easier way to transact with her customers, because now she could she could send and receive payments over her mobile phone. So I think we see a nice sort of blending there of this, if it's created in an intentional way, this convergence between identity leading to things like financial inclusion. But we can't take it for granted that that is going to be the outcome. I think in other situations we've seen, people who don't have IED but who want to use a mobile financial service actually going through an intermediary, so using a relative, a friend, or in some cases a stranger. And I think in the kind of demographics that we're primarily concerned with, there may not be as well an understanding or as complete an understanding of, I actually need to protect my PIN for my mobile wallet because other people could access this, or the person that is cashing out has to be trusted and has to be somebody who is actually a registered and legitimate agent. So I think where we don't have the autonomy for people over the kind of services that they're accessing because they aren't able to meet that kind of ID requirement, it often lends them or puts them in situations where they may be vulnerable to a whole other set of challenges, whether it's fraud or lost information or data protection issues or privacy issues, because they're missing that sort of foundational step. So I think it's very much a two-sided coin, and one that and because of that, it really necessitates a much deeper understanding of what these experiences are at the end user level, because I think it's one of those things we never really would have considered, is that we all keep our PIN codes safe, and we take it for granted. But in a lot of places, 15 people may know your PIN code, and that's just how it is. But as we get into more kind of sensitive services, whether it's your personal data and digital identity or financial service, there are different implications around that. So I think the digital literacy element of this is very essential in sort of determining whether some of these things will have the intended positive impact or unintended consequences.
I think that's a great example of the kind of assumption that someone like me, if I was going to sit down and make design a system for somebody, I would probably make the assumption that a PIN number is understood to be something you should keep to yourself. So this is exactly a great testament to why it's important to be doing this research. I'd like to open to the floor if there are any questions from the group here. Yeah.
Question about privacy in Aadhaar. Two things. One, what's your opinion about this centralization? Thank you. Question about privacy with Aadhaar. Two sides. One, the people you're talking to and what is their perception of their information going into something, if they even think about it or consider that, or I know a lot of the identity professionals are concerned about that, but I wonder if the people who are using it are. And then after your experience of talking to these people, if you're concerned about it. So your perception versus the individual's perception.
It's great. It could be a very lengthy response if I'm not careful. But I think on the personal side, let me just say.
I was just going to say, can we
I'm not gonna
collect
make
three
it,
questions?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Sorry,
if you
because I
want.
realized we've got 5 minutes. So
Okay. Sorry.
Okay, so Kyla, you mentioned that users are most likely to adopt ID systems or to feel a need to adopt one when there's a perceived utility and it's very clear to them what they'll be getting for this. And I'm curious about cases where you've seen that break down and where that hasn't worked out so well.
great, thank you. Just next to you.
Hi, I'm Shaylee Adenolfi from BankU. One thing that has helped us at BankU in making the case for our solution is the risk-based KYC. And they have that in some of the countries where we work. But could you maybe talk about where your research has led in countries where that they're considering not taking this tiered KYC or risk-based KYC approach?
I saw one last question here. Do you want to throw that in?
Yeah, so I just wanted to know your opinion about the gap between government-issued IDs in developing countries and developed countries, and how's that gap being treated? So, for example, someone who's working or traveling to any kind of purpose from a developing country and has a passport, let's say, or some kind of a government-issued ID, and how is that credible to the other country, I guess? Does that make sense?
Over to you. Yeah,
Okay,
divide and conquer.
I'm going to just, I could do conjecture a little bit on, I'm going to talk about the study that we've been working on, which is very much focused on users. So some of these sort of issues, both about the policy stuff on kind of how to treat KYC and how to do interoperability across borders of documents or something, didn't come up very much given the lens that we had on our data. So my answer is going to have to be a little bit more on this sort of what does Aadhaar mean kind of question. And that, on the other hand, does come up. Sort of personally, you'd asked about that, the ways in which Aadhaar is kind of weaving itself into all sorts of parts of transactions where maybe nobody thought it was going to be, or maybe they did, but they didn't really plan on it happening so quickly. I think that there are issues there to be looked at. Some of these issues around having to disclose everything about yourself so that you can access government service around some vulnerability, like HIV status or something like that. School lunches have come up. These are big issues and need to continue to be talked about. Like one of the ways they need to be talked about is how people understand them, and that is something I think we've done a good job in our research, but there's a lot of work still to do on understanding this intersection between digital literacies and the imagination of what happens with data. We can barely, we in this room barely know where our data sits and who has it and how it gets used and how those terms of service work with us or against us. Getting that mapped into somebody who has had 5 years of formal schooling, if that, and is really hard. So we find important roles for. These are quick takeaways. Two things. One, still material artifacts. Like the card, an Aadhaar number is a number. If you lose your card, it's no big deal. You go get another card. But that card means a lot to people, and it helps them understand who has seen and who hasn't. It's a strength and a weakness because they don't actually know. They use that card as if it's the number. It's not. It's a representation of the number. Pulling that out, I think, is important. The second is how this literacy and the lack of literacy interfaces where it gets complicated by intermediates and intermediation and good ones and bad ones, and paid services will enroll for you, and your cousin who knows your PIN code and everything. That stuff is everywhere. And understanding how to work within those systems as opposed to sort of closing your eyes and thinking it's not around, I could be a very helpful takeaway from some of this work. I would assume it's the same in some other countries as well. I've lived and worked in other places and seen some similar things.
Good. So maybe I'll quickly address the question on where we've seen the sort of demand side break down, and hopefully it's a sort of positive into a negative. And again, I'm not an expert on this particular case, but one that has been discussed a lot is the CNIC in Pakistan. So about a 98% coverage of the NADRA program. Very intentional to make sure that it was rolled out to the last mile, that women were brought in to register other women, and that it was kind of rolled out in a way that met some of the challenges that we've been discussing. But I think then there was this kind of utility question. So now everyone has it. There's this need from a security perspective, but from a kind of citizen value perspective, it wasn't fully being realized. And I think one of the things that has helped address that is making that a requirement for the BISP, the Benazir Social Income Support Program, which is the largest social protection payment scheme in Pakistan. And that's they've also harmonized the KYC for that with the KYC for mobile financial services. So now, for those people who wish to receive the transfer in that way, they use their CNIC to register. They can open a mobile account, a mobile financial services account in the same exercise, and then receive payments through Easy Paysa and receive the money on their mobile wallet. So that's, I think, a kind of more comprehensive approach from both a policy and technical perspective, but also an end-user utility perspective, has had a great outcome, but it wasn't sort of the way it initially started. And I'm sure there are, a host of other examples like that out there as we learn more about what will get users to engage either with these systems or sort of how they engage around those systems and how to incentivize them in if that is the intended goal. I think the risk-based KYC, I'll just really address briefly since I know we're running out of time, but certainly from a GSMA perspective, we advocate for tiered KYC so that we aren't exacerbating exclusion and that it's proportional to the kind of both the use case and the amount of funds being stored, saved, or transferred. But one of the things that we've uncovered very recently in our research is that as countries more actively enforce mandatory SIM registration, which is, again, this requirement for official proof of ID to activate a SIM card, of the 20 countries that host the highest refugee population, only 4 actually accept UNHCR-issued ID as a valid proof of identity. So we have this kind of policy and reality delta where we think, of course, mobile services are so fundamental for refugees, it's really a lifeline in crisis, but now we have 16 countries where increasingly it will be impossible for that group of people to access these services because of the KYC requirements and because they aren't taking a kind of either providing for an emergency KYC or a tiered-based approach. So I think it's an area that we'll see increasing scrutiny around. It's very much obviously tied to the kinds of services that are in question and what the level of assurance, which is sort of the technical term, should be for certain use cases. But certainly I think it's an area where we kind of may take for granted that people automatically have access to the proof of ID that they need to get on board with new digital programs, and we're seeing increasingly that the barrier to entry is being set higher and higher.
Well, I found this a fascinating conversation. I hope you did too. If you have further questions, I actually can recommend you talk to these guys. They're just scratching the surface in terms of the thinking they've done. There's also a chance, if you go to the identitiesproject.com website, you can submit questions for the researchers. They are in the field now, nearing the end of the project, but there's still a chance. So thank you so much for coming today, and see you around.
Thank you.